Did you expect otherwise?
No, everybody looks great.
That was great
Hello.
music.
That was great music.
That was good music.
I feel we got called into the
dance
principal's
like we were
office,
on
though.
Yeah.
We're sort of an unruly group
man's
here.
credentials.
We're going to hope to keep it in check for our 17 minutes here talking about politics. We got some of the smartest people covering the campaigns in Capitol Hill, so we're just going to jump right on into it. And I'm going to start with the question that we talked about a little bit upstairs, which is, I'm going to do this thing that candidates hate at the debates, which is the raise your hand game. All right, if Joe Biden gets in the race, can he win the nomination? Raise your hand if you agree.
You changed the wording of the question.
Oh, did I? All right. Well, Ryan, what do you think? Do you want to put it as chance, percent chance he can win? Is that how you would like to say it?
I'm going to steal Jamelle's line, which is he has a non-zero possibility, right? But that you got to come up with something new. But highly, highly unlikely
That he could win.
that he could win,
Okay.
unless Hillary Clinton collapses.
Yeah. Agree?
I agree completely.
Because that's your line.
Because it's my line, right? Biden's popularity right now is so much a function of his relative isolation from partisan politics, and if he jumps into the race, there's a very good chance that all of his gaffe making will suddenly become less funny, like his history will suddenly become more scrutinized, and he will suffer for it.
But Maria, Teresa, isn't he's the authentic candidate? He's the candidate of the Obama administration. He's a candidate that's polling better in a general election.
Because he's not in,
do any
right?
worse than Hillary Clinton?
No, but I think it's because he's not in. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that we have to clearly understand, too. He doesn't have, right now, the fundraising machine that's needed in the political race, and he doesn't have the infrastructure to turnkey. I think that what he's looking for is, he's basically the Democratic Party's plan B, right? So if something happens with Hillary that all of a sudden she can't come back from, he's the one that basically is going to be able to step in. But absent that, it's almost impossible at this point.
So, but we know that at the end of the year, 15 states' filing deadlines will have closed, including Texas and Ohio. So if there is an emergency break glass, he's got to decide before the end of the year. Do we agree? Can he wait longer?
Yeah, I think he has to get in. If he wants to be the Plan B candidate, he actually has to be running, I think. There's a historical thing here where no vice president for a two-term president has ever sought their party's nomination and lost. So in a way, Joe Biden could have a historic groundbreaking run for president if he chose to get in. I agree with all of them. Non-zero chance that he wins, but he really is Plan B.
He really doesn't have a chance. All right. John, I do want to start with you and again have everybody else jump in, but since I know you as the guy covering the Hill for all these years, tell us a little bit of this quote I thought was interesting from the soon-to-be former speaker, John Boehner, said of what's going to happen next. If there's a way to get things done so I don't burden my successor, I'm going to get it finished. What on earth does that mean? What does burdening his successor mean? Does this mean that he will try to get some stuff pushed through that a lot of Republicans maybe don't like, whether it's XM Bank or the transportation bill or something else? Can he do that? Will he do it? Will he do immigration?
He's been the only adult in the room for a long time in the House Republican Conference, and the reason that Kevin McCarthy is able to ascend is because Boehner's taken on the tough tasks. He's been the guy that's cracked down on the rebellions. He's been the guy that's put up budget bills and debt limit increases. And I think what he's saying is he'll try to figure out what it is he can get done that hasn't been done that doesn't destroy McCarthy. And he has a pretty good idea of what would destroy McCarthy, and I actually think it's a lot of stuff would destroy McCarthy.
Okay, so what would destroy McCarthy?
What? I think
seems like
immigration would destroy McCarthy.
Okay.
So I mean...
And that's because he's one of the folks that actually, behind closed doors, actually advocates for immigration. Is that why? Or
Right, well, I just think that whole act might reshuffle the entire Republican conference. I mean, you're going to have a window there of a couple of weeks between the election and when the next speaker actually takes over. And I think if you try to jam too much through there, you could, there's always the possibility that they would vote to vacate the chair again, as they were planning to do with Boehner at some point. So, I think he'll have some leash, but not a lot. Maybe he'll try to get a budget deal done that goes for longer than December.
Molly, do you think that's possible? I know you wrote a little bit about Boehner's exit.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm talking to folks on the Hill. What about that? A budget that gets us out of this crisis moment that we seem to be in.
Well, I mean, this has been a sort of impossible dream for Boehner for years, and I think if it were possible to do, he would have moved heaven and earth to do it. already. And I think something that we learned from the announcement of his exit was sort of how little goodwill there was for him. I don't think this is a conference that is disposed to give him a big legacy gift on his way out. But you saw the amount of celebrating there was among his fellow Republicans when he announced that he wasn't going to be Speaker anymore. And so, I don't think he's the only adult in the room. I think the majority of the Republican conference are grown-ups, and only a minority have been causing him all this trouble, but it's enough of them, and they represent enough of the party base that it's almost impossible to get the grown-ups together to do the grown-up things.
So the possibility of another government shutdown threat in December, high?
It's always possible. I mean, we went 2 years without a shutdown.
Whoa, we can take that sign. How many years without a government shutdown?
Right. It's like the accident. Dave had an accident in the factory, right?
That's because the deal had Paul Ryan's name on it.
Right. But so the point being that there was enough of a thaw that things ran more or less smoothly for 2 years. On the other hand, how do you get around this issue of Planned Parenthood that people are so riled up about? I don't know.
I want to change topics for a second to the person that I've asked everybody who they want to talk about. And of course, everybody wants to talk about Donald Trump because why not? A number of you have written about the fact that he has peaked. Maybe we are now on the other side of Trump momentum. Do you agree with this? What happens to him next? And what about the rise of Ben Carson?
I mean, I think Trump's rise is almost exclusively a function of the fact that he has received, depending on the week, 50 to 80% of all coverage of the presidential candidates since he entered the race on June 16th. If you look at the graph of media coverage and his polls, it's almost a perfect correlation. And since the second debate, he's now dropped, we have 5 or 6 national polls out, he's dropped 5 or 6 points. His rate of descent is about the same as his rise. And if you look at the media coverage, he's been eclipsed just a little bit by people like Carson and Fiorina. The tone of the coverage is a little bit more hostile. And so I think for the first time, you're starting to see that maybe this is a phenomenon that's not all that different than Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry and Newt Gingrich in 2011-12, who had similar polling surges because they were in the news a lot and then declines when people got a closer look. So right now, if we actually hit peak Trump, it will have been that second debate and the trend line.
And now
will
the
continue.
trend line keeps
But
going
he's
down.
also a master of getting himself in front of the cameras and keeping our attention on him. So I wouldn't underestimate his ability to keep it going. But I don't think that I think there's a lot of mental energy that goes into describing what Trump is and what the Republican Party is becoming because of Trump. And I'm very skeptical of most of those analyses that, he's some new right-wing European-style candidate or the base of the Republican Party has fundamentally changed. I think mostly it's a function of him being the most famous name that you know about, and when a pollster calls you at 6 o'clock, he's the person you heard on the news, and he's famous right now, and that's what is mostly explaining his rise.
But Jamelle,
I think you're more
Jeb Bush is
optimistic.
famous too,
Right.
and he's at 7%.
Well, I think it's 50. I think it's 50% that. I think it's 50% Trump does represent legitimate anxieties and fears within a non-trivial portion. I like "non" as a prefix today a lot.
Yeah.
A non-trivial portion of the Republican Party. And this portion's always been there. It's not a new phenomenon in Republican politics, but I think Trump, because of his fame, gives it a bit more visibility. And I think there is a temptation, and you see this with candidates like Ted Cruz. You kind of saw it unsuccessfully with Scott Walker, of trying to co-opt this in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's a very real thing that will persist for as long as his nomination fight continues.
And I think that's one of the reasons why you see Ted Cruz buddying up to Trump, knowing that he's probably of this descent, but he still needs that base. And I think that when you look at the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, I would argue that the Republican Party, when you're talking about Fiorina, Carson, and Trump, they know the America that they're trying to win, right? They know the America that they're trying to rally with that base, for better or worse. The Democratic Party is so disconnected for the most part about the emerging majority of Americans when we're talking about women and people of color. You're having a really hard time making that connection. And as an example, when you see Bernie Sanders, we were just having this conversation, Bernie Sanders went to Los Angeles. Like, it's the bastion of the Latino community. He filled up the Staples Center. one of my colleagues, really excited about Bernie Sanders, calls his dad in LA and said, "Hey, Dad, are you going to Bernie Sanders?" And his father responded, "Bernie who?" So there is a huge disconnect of who he's rallying towards that doesn't necessarily reflect the folks that he needs to win the presidency.
And,
And weren't you in Iowa with him?
Yeah, I was just
with
in
Bernie?
Iowa with him, and it's interesting that you bring that up because I saw him at the Latino Heritage Festival in Des Moines, and the audience for him there was, I don't know, 80, 85% white, maybe 90% white, and there were Latinos and Latinas that were there that saw him, but it was a very small minority of the group, and this was maybe 100 people, 120 people at most, but it was not, despite the fact that he was at the Latino Heritage Festival, it was a super white crowd, which struck me.
I think Sanders, I don't think Sanders, much like I don't think Trump is especially new in who he represents, I think Sanders is a very classic Democratic insurgent candidate. He is Bill Bradley. He is Howard Dean. He is sort of the kind of person who will, I think, persist through the entire process, but always at this he'll never be able to get past a certain hump because he appeals to just liberal, college-educated whites.
But this is why I think the comparison with Trump and Sanders is instructive, is that we know what the ideological base of Bernie Sanders is, right? We have enough competitive Democratic primaries in the last 3 decades to know he's Bill Bradley, Gary Hart, right, Howard Dean, and Barack Obama until he broke through with non-white voters. And he has this sort of 20 to 30% nationally that candidate's always going to get against a big establishment party figure like Hillary Clinton. Trump, if you look at the internals of the polls, he doesn't have an ideologically consistent base. Some people point to the polls and say, oh my gosh, he's winning evangelicals, he's winning business conservatives, and however else you want to slice up the Republican electorate. And I look at that and say, well, that's just a sugar high from his fame and being in the news because he doesn't actually have an ideologically coherent base in the Republican Party. It's sort of all over the place.
But what you see right now...
And I think that's a big difference between him and Sanders.
But I think that's actually, I think it's what you see right now actually in the House with this hell no caucus because we can say that on stage, hell no. But I think it's the same thing you're seeing, which is those guys aren't ideologically together. You can't define them by region or by ideology. Basically, they just want to burn the place down. And I think Trump has very much tapped into that. And I think the question is, and I agree that, obviously we see the polls come down. I wrote a piece after the debate that says this is the moment where we see the Teflon wearing thin a little bit. He's thin-skinned. How low does he go? How strong is that base of, I just want to rip everything up? And I think it's a significant portion of the Republican Party, and if there are other candidates in the race through several states, Donald Trump could basically just take off.
But I think what you bring up is rather interesting. Has he done so much damage to the Republican brand that it doesn't matter at the end of the day who the Republican Party runs because of that, right? Of the idea that he's not going to be he may not attract women and people of color based on what he's talking about. So, and then I think that's where all of a sudden the Republican Party has to have a deep conversation with them. Do they want to be a party that controls the House, or do they want the party that controls the White House, right? And I think that's their challenge right now.
Well, and I think that you bring up another important point, which is it points to the failure of the rest of the field of any other candidate to be compelling enough to surpass Trump. The reason he's in first place with 25% of the vote is that no other candidate has managed to catch people's imagination in that way. And the only other candidates who have even begun to do so are the other outsider candidates. And the ones that the establishment had pinned so much hope on, particularly Jeb, have had a really hard time getting voters at all interested in their candidacy. So, if assuming that Trump is not going to go away on his own, just take his
to get the media's interest, and most people are not.
Because I think the media
has the Republican Party
blamed.
actually created this scenario, right? I mean, how long can you actually go saying that you want to tear down government, that you don't want political insiders to run your party? How long before the candidates that you actually produce are outside of the game, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that they're challenged.
No, that's why, don't shed so many tears. There's a lot of commentary about shedding tears for John Boehner, but he built a majority on a certain style of
Right.
politics and a certain ideology, and you can't be totally shocked when the people you bring in
John-
in
Oh,
That was
2010.
in 2010, he walked, so they had a huge Tea Party rally outside the Capitol. Michelle Bachmann put it together with Scott Garrett and some of the other conservatives. And the big question is John Boehner going to come to this? Because they were considered kind of the crazies of the House. And not only did he come to it, he walked them out
And
of
he
the
wore a yellow
Capitol and
tie,
down
which
the
was,
steps.
and he walked the yellow tie, which was the color of the Tea Party. So he was like, I'm in.
He was completely both feet in. It brought him to the top. And
John
then
Boehner
killed
is
him.
he is the French revolutionary who gets eaten by his own revolution.
The cannibalism
Jamelle,
of
I
the
want
House
you-
Republicans.
But I do want to raise, we've been talking a lot about Republicans, but I want to go to Democrats because I agree with you, Maria Teresa, that Republicans may be doing some damage, and they've already done serious damage to their brand with minority communities, with younger voters. At the same time, this idea of the Obama coalition just transferring to Hillary Clinton also has to be Barack Obama. It was thanks to African American voters in places like Ohio and Florida. Can Hillary Clinton get that same level of turnout, and can she excite that coalition?
It's a bit of an open question, I think, among political scientists to the degree whether Obama's turnout with blacks was Obama, or was it Obama being familiar enough with black politics to sort of engage black civic groups and black civic organizations and sort of the entire realm of black community life. That Barack Obama was a black candidate. And my sort of case study for that is the the recent Virginia gubernatorial election where Terry McAuliffe is able to get Obama levels of turnout among African Americans, following a very similar strategy.
Right.
And so if Terry
So,
McAuliffe can do it,
And Terry McAuliffe's campaign manager, Robbie Mook, is now running the Clinton campaign.
Exactly, precisely.
So the argument you make, if it is in fact the latter and it's about engagement, there's nobody better at inside Democratic politics than the Clintons in terms of organizing constituencies and energizing constituencies.
But I actually think that I think a lot of folks are betting that emerging majority of the Obama campaign is going to transfer to Hillary.
Yeah.
And when you are on the ground and you start talking to her natural base, which is white progressive women, and they're not excited, I think that there is an enthusiasm gap that we're not talking about.
Yeah.
I actually think that the challenge is if, let's say, Trump all of a sudden disappears and the caustic language around him disappears, anti-women, anti-everybody, unfortunately, disappears.
loser! You are a loser for bringing that up, right? He would say.
worried about the engagement problem, because I think that just will solve itself.
All right, you guys, we are out of time.
That sign
That was
is very
fantastic.
scary,
And
yeah.
it says wrap up ASAP.
Don't forget.
Just got hit with a dart.
So yes, so thank you all very much. Thank our panel. And we will head out this way, right?